Computer. Okay. And I'm going to let Luisa's mother in. And then I'm going to change this. Okay. Today we're starting a new study, which we are excited about. It's on the book of Daniel. And I'm going to give you some background I always like to do in case Daniel comes up in a cocktail party, that you have some of I need my thing back. Some of the cocktail party information about Daniel, and then we're going to get into the book itself. So the book of Daniel is in the Old Testament. There is 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and Daniel is believed to be the author. And this is, a lot of us were on the study that we did with King David. And to put things in perspective, Daniel lived approximately 500 years after David and 500 years before Jesus. So I always like to have a time and a place. Another sort of tidbit, in the Hebrew Bible or in the Jewish Bible, the book of Daniel is in a different order than it is in the Christian Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, it is part of the writings. It's part of Job, the Psalms, Proverbs. In the Christian Bible, it's part of the major prophets. It's next to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So those are just fun facts. Before we get in,
was that fun?
Those fun facts
for anybody.
Yeah.
I'm just okay.
But before we get into the historical background, I want you to do a little bit about how the authenticity of the book of Daniel is sometimes questioned.
Yeah, and this is really important. It's important to our faith. Daniel is not included in the Jewish Bible in the prophets, and there's sort of this dividing line on what's a prophet. In the Old Testament, a lot of the prophets were there they were almost assigned to a king, and they came in and told him when he'd stepped over the line, when he wasn't doing God's will. But there's also prophecy in the sense of foretelling the future. And while Daniel is obviously not assigned to one of the kings of Israel, the prophecies in this book are some of the most important in all of our scriptures. Daniel, this book is really pivotal in the Christian faith. And it's because of those prophecies. There are people who do not believe that prophecy happens. They don't believe that miracles happen. And so they look for ways to intellectualize the scriptures. And the prophecy becomes really important because Daniel's prophecies turn out to be uncanny about how accurate they are in terms of kingdoms that would arise. And so there are people that have said, and some of you may have encountered this if you've looked into it, some may not, but there are a lot of people who say, well, it was written after the fact. What happened was they came along a couple of 100 years later. Somebody came in and wrote this, and it's easy to do prophecy when you're doing it after the fact. And their arguments are pretty easily debunked, but you see this sort of a separation. You see this sort of a dividing between people who absolutely do not want to believe in God's work in the world, even though some of them are theologians, and other people who look at it and say, this is amazing. There's every reason to believe that Daniel, in fact, there's a lot of new historical things that this was written when it claims to have been written. But there's one other thing I want to read to you real quickly. We did this study on King David. And at the end of his life, if you remember, he wanted to build the temple, and he was told, it's not your job. So David set the groundwork for Solomon, his son, and he was promised that his son would be able to build this temple. And we didn't go into Solomon, but after all the time of building, after everything was just the way he wanted it to be, and the temple was a fabulous structure, they dedicate the temple to Yahweh, and Yahweh consecrates it. Okay, he says, yes, this is the place, this will be my place of sacrifice. And it says then when that was done, let me read this to you. This is in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. Or pardon me, chapters, it's 2 Chronicles 7. That was the reference. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 11. When Solomon had finished the house of the Lord and the royal palace, successfully carrying out all that was in his heart to do for the house of the Lord and for his own palace, the Lord appeared to him at night and said to him. So keep in mind, this is at the beginning of the temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem as the capital is young. And at the moment, just right when he finishes the temple, God comes to him, I guess in a dream, it says at night, and says, I've heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. Let me skip down some. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. For I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart and as for you, now here's the important part. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, doing all I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and ordinance, then I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with your father David when I said, you will never fail to have a man to rule over Israel. So God had made this promise. And he says, if you keep my covenants, if you keep my statutes, I'll be faithful. I'll be there with you. But if you turn away and forsake the statutes and commandments I have set before you, and if you go off to serve and worship other gods, then I will uproot Israel from the soil I have given them, and I will banish from my presence this temple I have sanctified for my name. I will make it an object of scorn and ridicule among the peoples. This is at the beginning, and this is going to be important to keep in mind as we read through. Now the last part, hundreds of years before. 500 years before, to be precise.
Scott, read that last part again, just what the curse was. What did he say?
I will uproot Israel from the soil I have given them. Now we're going to be studying about Israel being taken captive, being uprooted, taken away. That's what we're going to see. That's why you'll begin to recognize this, but this was foretold when the temple was consecrated. And so my point, some of this is to show that when we say Daniel is not prophetic, Daniel was prophesied. The time of Daniel was prophesied 500 years before. Here's the last part. And when this temple has become a heap of rubble, all who pass by it will be appalled and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? And others will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. Because of this, he has brought this disaster on them 500 years before. And what Solomon is told, when this temple becomes a heap of rubble. Now let's move back to Daniel.
So we're going to do some historical background. And one of the things that's important to us, there's a lot of history, especially in the first 6 books of Daniel. And this is, and we have to put it in context, but we're not doing history for history's sake.
We don't want to do a history class, but the history is a big part of our understanding of these scriptures.
I'm going to change the view, and I don't know if it changes it for you, but it changes it for us here, I think. If, no, maybe it didn't.
You want the picture up?
No, I want full screen. Oh, speaker's view, I think, right?
Okay.
And then I'm going to do speaker's view. And the reason I'm doing speaker's view, that's funny, it turns to somebody. I don't want to do that. Let me Let me
Yeah,
do-
somebody left their
Let me
seat.
do.
Just go to
view.
gallery view and
Okay,
live with
sorry.
it.
Okay, so what we're starting, we did, as Scott, we did this long study on King David. And when we finished King David, he had appointed his son Solomon to become king. And at that point, at the end of David's life and as king, and at the beginning of, and during Solomon's entire rule, the kingdom of Israel was united. Do you want to hit the map? So, and that's why I want to do it. Do you think I can do that so everybody sees it? I mean, we see it better because I don't see it
know.
well here.
It's highlighted now. Try
It's highlight, speaker's view. There we go. No?
There's the map.
Hmm,
I don't know.
I don't know
And
why.
that's something, and it
I know.
exit full screen.
Exit full screen.
I had it up this morning.
Oh, shoot. I know, but now it's gallery view. Let's go back. Back to one. There we go. Okay, so anyhow, those of you who can see, can see. I'm sorry. So Israel, so it was a united kingdom for 40 years. When Solomon dies, his son,
Rehoboam.
Gets over the throne. But as soon as his son takes over, he immediately loses the northern portion to a guy named Jeroboam, and it becomes a divided kingdom. So Israel was a united kingdom for a little over 40 years. That's it. And it becomes a divided kingdom. And over the next 460 years, both the northern and the southern kingdom go through about 20 kings each. Okay. Some of them good, most of them bad. And when you read from starting in Kings and Second Chronicles all the way through, you hear a phrase over and over again with these 40 different kings. And it said the king, they introduced the king, and it says he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. You hear that over and over again. So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom had 20 kings each.
Roughly, yeah.
Roughly, right. So, and the northern kingdom, if you look at the northern kingdom, it ceased to exist in 722 BC when the Assyrians conquered it.
Good.
And now we're talking about the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is where Jerusalem is. And I'm going to go to image 2.
Hold on a second.
Okay.
Go back to the other one.
Okay, go
You
back.
guys know, for those of us that are online, if we click speaker view, then we see it full screen.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl.
Zoom has its own set of rules that it's amazing. So
There you go. For everybody here, now they can see. So there is the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So after Solomon, Rehoboam, his son, became king of all of it, but lost the northern kingdom very quickly to Jeroboam. Then we move forward, and during this time period, there was a bunch of kings. Okay, so now we're in 640 because we're in the southern kingdom, and we need to know who these kings were. When Daniel was born, it's believed that Daniel was born in 620 BC. So when he was born, Josiah was king of Jerusalem, of Judah, of the southern portion of the kingdom. And Josiah became king when he was 8 years old, which always, when someone becomes king of 8 years old, I always think, so who's really king? You know, it's his second in command and he's the king. But Josiah was king, and after, it was the first good king for 57 years. So they had a bunch of bad kings. Josiah becomes king, and he believes in God. He once he becomes an adult, he is going to do some things. And what he does is he's renovating or working on the temple, and he finds copies of God's law in
the book of the law.
the book of the law in the temple, and he reads it. And what you were
and
going
it
to
had
say.
been lost. And this is so bottom line, the split between North and South is political. And politics separates people. They divide up and they beat each other up, and they actually divided into 2 kingdoms. And then they have all these series. It's all the political struggling. And along comes Josiah comes, and he's going to renovate the temple. And in the process, he actually finds the book of the law. Now, you got to think about how far away they had come to have lost track of the law. I mean, they lost track of it. They didn't even know it was there, the book. And he comes across and he says, oh my gosh, look at we've been doing wrong. And he begins he reinstates even the Passover. They weren't really celebrating the Passover anymore. So they kind of did, but it was more of a formality. And so Josiah reinstates, yes, hit the thing.
Is the book of the law and the scrolls two different things?
Well, they didn't have bound books, so it was all scrolls. It is the same thing. And it is the section that contains the laws that they're supposed to be abiding by, God's statutes. And they not only are not abiding by them, they lost the book. They stuck it on a shelf someplace and just sort of didn't get back around to it. And that says a lot about the state that Israel was in. Josiah comes, reinstates these things, and Daniel is born during the time of the reign of Josiah.
So, and that's important. So he was raised understanding about Yahweh, about the law, and he believed it and he followed it. After Josiah became
Jehoahaz.
and he only reigned for 3 months, and he was Josiah's son, and he reverted to evil practices. And he was carried off to Egypt, where he died. Then
Jehoiakim.
And he, at this time, Babylon was becoming a threat. And so he agreed to go along with Babylon, and which was Nebuchadnezzar. And then the Babylons, and he decided, no, I don't want to. And the Babylonians sent reinforcements and subdued Judah. And then his son,
Jehoiakim.
yes, he reigned for 3 months before he had to surrender. He had to surrender Jerusalem, and the Babylonians 10,000 Babylonians were exiled.
Jews were exiled to Babylon.
And then finally, some of this, we're going to see some of it in chapter 1, and some of it we're going to see later on. And then Zedekiah, who was
Zedekiah,
his uncle, he was installed as a puppet king. So some of this is just important to keep this piece of paper.
It's always a struggle. Do you explain it up front or try and explain it as you go along? But at least you've seen some of this. What you need to get out of this is that these kings have weakened Israel. They have turned from God. And Egypt comes up and actually takes one of the kings. They're getting picked on from all sides. Babylon emerges, though. Often in this time, a kingdom is basically a city. The areas surrounding it are part of the kingdom, but these kingdoms are in these big walled cities. Babylon is 50 miles south of Baghdad, or 50 kilometers south of Baghdad. Babylon has suddenly emerged on the scene. They're always at war, but all of a sudden Babylon out of nowhere flares up and they become huge. Babylon, two of the ancient wonders of the ancient world were in Babylon. This city is the most amazing thing really in the world at that time. But in this area, it's a marvel. It's amazing. They flare up and they only last 70 years. They flare up, come down, deal with Israel. And as you see from way back, this was part of God's plan, and it can't be any more clear. But these kings in Israel, one of them tried to make an alliance with Egypt. Egypt sort of bloodied Babylon's nose. And so this guy says, oh, good, I'm going to get rid of these Babylonians. And he goes and makes an alliance with Egypt. And it makes the king of, this Babylonian king angry. And that's when he comes in and really just wipes everything out. So, you see the setting. you see the politics. You ready to move on?
I am. So before we're going to read Daniel 1 now, but the other person you need to know is Nebuchadnezzar, and he's actually Nebuchadnezzar 2. Nebuchadnezzar 1 was his father. His father was an Assyrian general, and when Assyria fell apart, he took over Babylon and then named his son king. So Nebuchadnezzar that we know is really Nebuchadnezzar 2. So we are now in 1 Daniel. Do you want to read 1 Daniel? You want me to?
Go ahead if you want, or you want me to.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord delivered into his hands Jehoiakim, king of Judah, along with some of the articles of the house of God. He carried these off to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, where he put them in the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring in some Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without blemish, handsome, gifted in all wisdom, knowledgeable, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace, and to teach them the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them daily provisions of the royal food and wine. They were to be trained for 3 years, after which they were to enter the king's service. Among these men were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. The chief officials gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego.
Let's stop for a moment.
Okay.
What you see has happened is Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the hill in this area, and he's come in and he's beaten down Jerusalem, he's beaten down the Jews, and he allows them to, it like often happens, they become a vassal state. As long as you send me taxes and you behave yourself, I'll leave you here. But he carried away some of the belongings out of the temple just to show who's who, to show his dominance. And he was known for doing that and sticking these belongings. Some people tried to say, oh, this is make-believe, because that was not a common practice at the time. And then they found all these written references to this treasure room that Nebuchadnezzar had where he did this. I mean, it's historical fact. But he carries this stuff off, and then he tells his chief steward, go down to this place, and I want you to bring back a group of their best and brightest. I want you to bring the ones that are not only good looking, but they're wise, they're knowledgeable, they're educated. But you notice it talks about their royalty and nobility. So he takes their leadership, he takes their future, the people who might be a threat to him at some point. And he says, bring them back here. And basically, we're going to turn them into Babylonians. The plan is let them serve in my court, and maybe at some point send a few of them back, and they become the leaders in their old country, but they're really Babylonians now. So the first thing he does is he takes away their Jewish names. All of those names.
I want to show 2 things. First of all, let me show image 3 real quick. This just gives you an idea of the possible path that the Israel captives, or the captives from Judah, went from Jerusalem back to Babylon. It said it was 1,250 kilometers, which is 750 miles. They estimated it would have taken 2 months for them to travel there. And then what Scott's saying here, this, when you go through these, do you want to go through the names?
Yeah, I wasn't going to, because
Yeah.
it's okay.
No.
So all of their names, anytime you see L in a Jewish name, you see the letters E-L, Daniel, Ezekiel. The L means God. And almost anytime you see a J-A or a J-A-H, that's a short for Yahweh. And so the names often have meanings. Daniel means God is my judge. It could mean God has judged, but it still is a reference to El, to God, to the one God. Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who is like the Lord. Azariah means Yahweh is my helper. And what happens is they've been given these names as a tribute to God, as a reminder to them and everyone that they serve God. They bring them to Babylon and they give them Babylonian names. Belteshazzar, Bel will protect. Bel was one of their gods. There is a book in some of these, they're known as Gnostic Gospels. Sometimes they get included in, they tell people they're part of our scriptures. One of them is Bel and the dragon. Well, Bel is a Babylonian god, and they don't really tell us that. So anyway, we've got one's named Shadrach, and it's inspired by one of their gods named Aku, Meshach, belonging to Aku, and Abednego, which is a servant of Nego or Nebo, which is one of the Babylonian gods. So he gives them a new identity and says, instead of being known to people by a name that's about the Hebrew God, I'm going to give you a new identity that is Babylonian and has to do with Babylonian gods. And then he gives them food from the king's pantry. And when that happens, when it's talked like this, it means it's brought to them fully prepared. It doesn't mean that they hear, this is your Amazon food delivery. They get brought in like nobility, pre-cooked, prepared food that is from the king's own store. It doesn't mean they're eating with the king, but they get brought this and they're treated like royalty. And it's seductive and it's intended to be. And once again, the intention is to completely convert them from Jews into Babylonians.
You want to change, can we change this back to?
From both parts of Israel, north and the south, the royalty that comes in?
That's a really good question. And I have to stop and think.
No,
This
it
is
was
Judah only. By
but-
this time, the northern kingdom
It disappeared.
had gotten, hauled off. Judah was able to hold out for such a long time, and that's where Jerusalem is. But the northern kingdom is non-existent. There's still people scattered through the countryside.
Yeah,
What do you want to
it-
go back to?
No, we're fine now.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to read, I'm starting at verse 8 through 14, Daniel's faithfulness. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's food or wine. So he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself. Now God had granted Daniel favor and compassion from the chief official, but he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking thinner than those of the other young men your age? You would endanger my head before the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Asherah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearances with those of the young men who are eating the royal food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he consented to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the steward continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables instead.
So again, hopefully you'll understand the history is for us to understand our own faith better. But the food is good food. There are types under kashrut, kosher. There are some things that are prohibited to eat. But when they use the word food, when the Hebrews use the word food, it means it's the right stuff, but it hasn't been handled right. Especially because, and we're actually told this, the Babylonians would first sacrifice their meat, or at least a big portion of it, to their gods. And Daniel knew this, and it makes it not clean, not ritually clean to eat. You see an echo of that way up in the New Testament, where there are believers who are worried that some of the meat in the marketplace has been sacrificed to idols. It's kind of amazing how these things continue to flow through. But vegetables, except under really extreme circumstances, are always going to be kosher. And so Daniel is bold enough to say, you know, I'm not going to defile myself. I don't want to defile myself. Would it be okay if we just eat vegetables? And you see that this steward, this head steward, is not hostile. You know, he just says, you're going to get me into trouble if I don't do what I'm told. Daniel says, let's do an experiment. Bring us vegetables to eat. And at the end of 10 days, if we look bad, call it off.
And first of all, how old's Daniel? How old?
And this was that's the next thing. And this is what's important to remember about this part. Daniel is 14 years old. 14. You know, we have gotten to the point that we've decided that our offspring are children until they're 26 or something, when they have to get off of our insurance. They have a rite of passage. We all know about it. And all of a sudden I'm blank. What is it? Bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
What happened to me? Boy, there's a senior moment. Bar mitzvah at 12. But at 14 years old, Daniel is a man. And Daniel has a way about him that rather than challenge these people, he just says, I don't want to defile myself because of my beliefs. Can we do this? 14 years old. And the guy agrees, and it says that they looked better than everyone else at the end of 14 days or 10 days. And there are people who say this is proof that a vegan diet is better.
And there's the Daniel diet. So if you read about the Daniel diet, this is where the Daniel diets come in. And you think to yourself, what?
That is not a sort of a historical Jewish belief. But anyway, the big point of that is this 14-year-old has the presence and the conviction to do this. And he does it on behalf of his 3 other friends that are with him. Yeah.
And the idea that Nebuchadnezzar is not necessarily known as a nice guy. I mean, this is a place where, you know, going against somebody, you can die.
Nebuchadnezzar rules with an iron hand, but he's not dumb. I mean, these things he's doing are, if your goal is to cement your power, to solidify over a big area, he's really doing the right things. And keep in mind, he's treating them good. He is treating them extremely good because what he wants, and he does recognize, he says that this group of young men that they've brought in from Israel are unlike, they're head and shoulders above. They are, you know, they're well-spoken, they're well-educated, they have a gravitas, they have a presence. And so he treats them well. But even at that, you have to worry if you contradict the king. He's known for having people put to death because he makes it clear to everyone, I'm in charge.
Daniel's wisdom, verse 17. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom, and Daniel had insight into all kinds of visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the time specified by the king, the chief officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all the young men, he found no one equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus.
It says that they were sent for 3 years to these Chaldeans and did a lot of research on that. and there's sort of this group of the what you'd call the wise men. And this 3-year program was not unique to Daniel and those other three. It was a program that they had. It's sort of like the, you know, the
Going to university.
university,
The executive
literally,
track, yeah.
executive training, fast track program. And so these three go into this sort of established thing, and they stand out, or these four, they stand out. They're good with languages. I mean, they are outstanding young men, and Nebuchadnezzar understands it. So at the end of the 3 years, they pass the test, and he goes to them, and they have answers. It mentions that Daniel has an understanding of dreams. And it turns out that the Babylonians paid a lot of attention to dreams. These ancient Babylonians, and it mentions this obviously for a reason. We're going to see it again, but this is one of the gifts that Daniel has been given. So you see how they have established within Babylonian society, they have the trust and admiration of Nebuchadnezzar, who's arguably the most powerful man on the planet at this point.
How did
Put
they
the mic.
maintain their Jewish faith in these 3 years?
How did they maintain their Jewish faith? That's actually gonna be a part of the chapters. But one of the ways they maintained it, you see, it's kind of an interesting thing. The name being called by another name, they didn't get upset about. But the diet, because there are no prohibitions against somebody calling you by another name, but there are against defiling yourself through, they have these dietary laws, and they clung to those. And that's one of the ways that they did it. This is really the start of that story. But it's clear that they did.
Well, and it brings up a good point, Sally. A lot of this, as we read Daniel, and one of the things that last line, he remained there, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. He was 14 when he got there, and he was there for 70 years. I don't know. I just sort of lost that, as far as, and one of the things we talked about this morning, this is an aside, but we talked about how Daniel is definitely one of those books that many of us, I will say, have a 3rd grade understanding of Daniel, because what do I know about Daniel? I know about Daniel and the lion. And some of us know about the furnace and his 3 friends in the furnace. But other than that, that's sort of the 3rd grade understanding of Daniel.
That's what we get. And, if you don't mind me digressing a little bit, and if you do mind, I don't know, I've got the microphone. I told you at the beginning of this that this is a pivotal book for our faith. They don't teach us, as a rule, a lot of in-depth stuff about Daniel and about the prophecies, but theologians argue incessantly over the book of Daniel. And there's a question: either the prophecies of Daniel are real, and that's important, or they're not. And that says that none of it. There's a point, and I'll just tell you from memory rather than go look the thing up, but there's a point where Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, standing in the temple, then it's time to head for the hills. And that's the short version of it. But he says, as told by the prophet Daniel. So if Daniel is the book of Daniel is a fake, then Jesus was duped by it. And by extension, Jesus is not who he says he was. Because if he is in fact God incarnate, if he is the Word who became flesh, and he has that knowledge of God, and then he says he would know if this prophecy was fake. And if it's fake and he didn't know it, by extension, he's not who he says he is. We're not told a lot of this. The people who are teaching us argue with each other a lot. And there are people who teach Daniel in the lion's den and the three guys in the furnace who really don't believe any of it. And you know they don't because they take the position that the whole book is just sort of a tale. But keep in mind, if this book is just a tale, then Jesus wasn't who he said he was, because he quotes it as authoritative prophecy. And if he was taken in, then he's not who he says. So this is an important book.
And prophecy in general, I know you had a discussion about that, but prophecy in general for the believer tells the believer, acknowledges that God knows the end from the beginning, past, present, and future. So when prophecy shows up in the Bible, it's for the believer to have faith in the Bible. The truth is out there.
We often, and I always struggle with prophecy, we often struggle with prophecy, and people, you don't know, you don't understand until it's fulfilled. And then you go, oh, hey, oh no, now I see it. But you're exactly right. And thank you. You always have good comments. It's exactly that.
This is Rita, by
This
the
is
way.
Rita. Yeah, this is our friend.
Everybody wrestles with prophecy, and they're wrestling with it very hard today because there are a lot of prophets out there. But that's the deepest understanding that I've been able to find, that God's faithful and he knows the future and he tells his people, this is what's going to happen.
And he did it in the past. And so the other things that he says are true. And that makes, as I said, as we study this, that makes this a really important book of the Bible. And we aren't, there's a whole struggle going on out there that we're largely unaware of. You want to? Oh.
No, well, and the other part here is Daniel living 70 years in a world that is definitely at odds to his belief system, but he was able to live 70 years in a place, and he started out at 14, making his stand, doing it the right way, doing it a way that didn't make a stand. And
he didn't get in their face. He just, stood fast in his own beliefs. And back to your question about the first part of this, there's a portion of this book that is precisely the story of how Daniel maintained his Jewishness in this environment, but 70 years. Okay. Another good question. Did he choose to stay 70 years? Here's the thing. If we're going to really look at this, and you look back at what I read you at first, did he choose to get carried away? Did he choose to get carted off? And you see, obviously he didn't. I mean, you don't have to really be told he didn't choose to get carried away into captivity. You see that this was part of a plan. And I have to believe that it was also part of a plan that he stay there. And I think he understood that. I think we see in his actions.
And we don't know because it was King Cyrus that did allow them to go back, correct?
Later, it was Cyrus, yes.
At that time, he's got no place to go. Where's he going?
Well, that's the understanding when we think of King Nebuchadnezzar taking 10,000, he only took 10,000, and then he went back again. So King Nebuchadnezzar went to Jerusalem 3 times. The first time was in 605 when he took these 10,000 people. The second time he went again to make sure everybody was following his rules and take back the pretend king that he had set up there. And that was in 595, I think. And at that time he took Ezekiel, who was a prophet, and Ezekiel ended up in Babylon. The third time Nebuchadnezzar's guys, including Nebuchadnezzar, went to Jerusalem was in 586. And at that time, that's when he destroyed the temple. But to say he destroyed the temple and he killed a lot of people, but there was still Jews in Judah.
You can't carry off everybody in a country. And so what he did was carry off the best and the brightest. That's what he really wanted to do.
But the temple wasn't destroyed until 586.
That comes, to be covered later. This is worth talking about though, Sally, and this question about, and Gene, you said at that time he had no place else to go. There's a certain truth to that. There's a prophet Hosea that as a sign to Israel of how they have turned away from him, Hosea is instructed to go marry a prostitute. Horrific thing, okay, for a good young Jewish boy. And to have these children with her. And he becomes a sort of a living parable to the Jewish people to show how, and as it says, they've gone a whoring after other gods. Okay. Hosea accepts this is his job. This is what he's been called to do, and he does it. On occasion, I felt like that. I've told Mary, I feel a little like Hosea right now. Not the same thing, but obviously,
Good.
but
Thanks.
in terms of having to do something distasteful in service to God. Daniel gets carried off, and whether he could have left, because we see that Cyrus allows people to go back, Daniel's held in high esteem. He might have even at least been able to say, well, let me go visit my homeland. Let me go back to Jerusalem. But it's an important thing that you've asked, because it's pretty clear that Daniel sees this as part of God's plan, and his job is to stay there and do what he does. And I have no doubt that some of Daniel rubbed off on the Babylonian society, and we see some evidence of that. So it is a question, because maybe more important than all the rest of this is, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we build on that? And the fact is that sometimes we're called upon to do things that are either distasteful or certainly contrary to our nature. And what we see in Daniel is that he does it, but even though he's in this he's a stranger in a strange land, he doesn't leave his service to Yahweh. You want to go ahead with the reading?
No, that's the end of the chapter.
But
Oh.
at the beginning of the chapter, it tells you that God gifted them.
Oh.
I mean,
Yeah.
you want authority? You know, the man himself said it to me, and I think it's more than the academies or the universities that they had at that location. I mean, they could have been in any other place and gotten that word.
I appreciate you saying that, Gene. That was one of the things that we intended to stress and somehow didn't. In verse 2, this is chapter 1, in verse 2 it says, and the Lord delivered into his hand, that's Nebuchadnezzar's hand, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, along with some articles. We're supposed to get this message. God delivered them into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And when you really understand that Nebuchadnezzar is a phenom in the world. I mean, he runs for a while everything, but Babylon flares up, comes in and takes these, and they last 70 years. Only 70 years. They flare up, they do this job, and then they're gone. I mean, just gone. It was part of God's plan. And that's one of the things we are supposed to get out of this story of Daniel. They had been warned over and over. The prophets to the kings keep telling them, and God keeps sending word. And we can say this is all allegory, but they were told, if you keep this up, I'm gonna deliver you into the hands of your enemies. And you go all the way back to the consecration of the temple, and he says, you know, if you don't follow, if the kings don't stay true to this, I'm gonna have Israel gathered up and taken away. And they are. One of the other points Mary touched on, Nebuchadnezzar comes in. We always hear about the Babylonian exile. He takes 10,000 people and he leaves everybody else. He takes the wealthy, the influential, the people who make the wheels of power turn, and he leaves the rest of the people there. And it's almost a disdain for the common people. What he knows is these are the influential folks. These are the ones, if somebody's going to gather the people and raise them up against me, it's going to be one of the people among this 10,000. So the Babylonian exile is 10,000 people, not the whole country. And the funny thing is, you know, they say the good guys always win because they write the history books. They refer to it as the Babylonian exile, but it's really a small portion of the people who lived in Israel at the time. And so the people who wrote the history books think the whole country is in exile because we were. It's an amazing perspective how they see themselves, and it's part of the problem. So he carries those people away. Is there anything else we want to get out of chapter 1?
No.
At that point,
Hit the
we
button.
have a little time, I don't know. The people remaining have already abandoned God. They've already given up, can't find the law books, can't do anything that, you know, they do what they want to do and not what the old man upstairs is telling them. So
That's
if
true.
you're King Nestor, hey, you know, these guys aren't bothering me.
Okay, another point to look at in there, as Nebuchadnezzar comes in 3 times, he comes in and establishes dominance, and he sets up a puppet king. He sets up a guy he thinks, and that's a common thing to do, and it's actually a wise thing to do. And this puppet king sees, as I mentioned, sees Egypt sort of bloody his nose, Nebuchadnezzar's nose, and this bonehead decides to go make an alliance with Egypt. And Egypt's only won this one battle. Nebuchadnezzar goes back, regroups, but this guy makes an alliance. And so, you know, Nebuchadnezzar comes back and he kills off Egypt, and he goes back to this puppet king and rips him out of the place. You're right. The people have turned away, and the king at that time, if he had just said, you know what, we get to keep worshiping Yahweh. All we really have to do is pay taxes to this guy. The part that's important, we still have. But no, he's got to be involved in the politics of it. He's got to be involved in the power and the dominion, and it gets Israel wiped out. And as we see later, when he does that, Nebuchadnezzar then is angry, and he comes back and does what was prophesied. He tears the temple down. And they go to the trouble, just like the Romans, of taking the blocks of stone off of each other. He tears it down, destroys the temple. And there are elements of this that we see play out in modern times. And that's why another reason it's important. The thing I read you early about Solomon's time, that's the chapter where God says, if my people who are called according to my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their evil ways, I will hear them from heaven and heal their land. And they didn't listen to that. You know, if you want to see any parallels in today, if my people who are called according to my name will humble themselves, we don't like to do that, and pray and turn from their evil ways, you see how things come out when we refuse to do that. That's what's playing out in Daniel's time. Whether it plays out like that in today's time, whether we have that, I'll leave that up to you, but there are certainly parallels.
That's it for today. Chapter 2 is we're going to look at Daniel's first ability to interpret a dream for King Nebuchadnezzar.
You understand how, if you remember how important dreams are in Babylonian society, and that one little verse about Daniel, that he has this ability to understand all manner of dreams, he's put there for a reason. And that's what so read ahead and you'll see that play out next week.
I saw that to be only Daniel and not the other 3.
You are correct. It is Daniel and not the other 3. And that's why there's a book of Daniel and not with the other guys. Yeah,
He could interpret dreams that he's not told what the dream is. pretty unfair question for the rest of it.
It is, and it makes this an amazing thing. God, we ask for wisdom. We ask to see the things that you have in store for us, what you want from us, not just the history, but the things we're taught by the history, that you really do care and that what we do here matters. And first, the wisdom to see it, and more importantly, the wisdom to act on it. We're always thankful for the words. Be with us this week. Amen.
Man, you guys can unmute yourselves. Let me see if I can unmute them. I don't think I can. There you go.
Well, you have me for a
There
minute.
you go. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Enjoy
Thank
it.
you.
So long.
Okay. See you later. See you Tuesday, Carol.
Okay.
Okay. See you later. Bye-bye.
It's
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
great
Thank
to
you.
see Cindy on the call.